It was just past midnight when Sarah knocked on my bedroom door. I wasn't sleeping. I was lying in the dark, listening to the house, as I had done every evening since Dorothy's death. Sarah was 12 years old, and she spoke quietly but clearly. "Grandpa, run. They're talking about putting everything in their names. You won't have anything left." I put my hand on hers. I said, "I know, sweetheart. I know." She looked at me with the expression of someone who doesn't know whether she is telling the truth or protecting her grandfather. Both were true. Both were enough. To understand this story, you need to know what this house really is. Not a building, not an address in a register. It is the only thing on this earth I created from nothing, with money saved over years, with weekends spent laying foundations while others rested, with plans that Dorothy and I spread across the kitchen table and sometimes stained with red wine. It is the house where my daughter learned to walk, the house where Dorothy died. Anyone who tells me I live here through the generosity of others has never built anything in their life worth keeping. Before I go on, if you're watching this for the first time, subscribe to the channel and write to me in the comments from which country you're watching right now. It moves me every time to see how far these stories travel. Some write from places I have never visited, and yet understand exactly what I mean. That is why I tell them, not as therapy or revenge, but as a mirror. And now back to Arthur Whitfield, that is me, and to the story that began on a night when a 12-year-old girl was braver than every adult in that house put together. I am 70 years old, a retired civil engineer, a widower for 6 years. Dorothy died on a Friday evening in November, quietly, without drama, as she had done everything in her life. After that, I lived alone in this house for 3 years, and I won't pretend it was easy. It was hard. Not because of the silence, I knew the silence. It was hard because every corner carried something of hers. The kitchen tiles she had chosen on a trip, the oak bookshelf I built for her books, the apple tree we planted together in the garden that bears fruit every autumn. As when Julie asked if she and Craig could move in temporarily, I said yes without hesitating. Craig had just sunk his last business, and they needed time, stability, solid ground. I thought, this is my daughter, this is my family. What else was I supposed to do? I cleared the guest room, bought new bedding, and cooked Julie's favorite meal that first evening. I still remember how Craig thanked me that night, how he said I was a great father-in-law. Those words sound different in my memory today, as if he already knew exactly what he had planned to do. The first sign came at 3 weeks. I returned from the garden, and the sitting room looked different. The sofa was no longer where Dorothy had placed it, in the same spot for 20 years, never moved an inch. Craig had reorganized everything. When I asked why, he said it flowed better now. He was smiling as he said it. I looked at the room that no longer seemed mine and said nothing. I told myself it was a small thing. People settle in, need their own space. I didn't yet understand that this wasn't carelessness. It was the first gesture of a long and calculated takeover. 4 months later, my workshop had disappeared. Not exactly disappeared. My tools were in boxes in the garage, neatly packed, as though someone had organized a quiet funeral. Craig had converted the room into an office. New desk, second screen, a sign on the door that said study. He told me only after everything was already installed and in place. I stood before my boxed saws and planes and tried to be fair. He works from home, I told myself. He needs the space. But something in me registered clearly. He no longer asks. He informs afterwards, or simply says nothing at all. At a family dinner, he cut across me 3 times in the same conversation. Not in passing, deliberately, with the tone of someone establishing a hierarchy before witnesses. The guests noticed. I saw it in their looks, that brief discomfort people feel when they witness a humiliation, and don't know whether to intervene or keep staring at their plate. I let him speak. I kept eating. But that evening I began to see things I had ignored, or chosen not to see. Craig was no longer behaving like a guest. He was behaving like a man who had already taken possession. Then he took control of the household finances. He explained it as a practical arrangement. He was earning well again. He would cover the running costs. I had nothing to worry about. It sounded like consideration, and at first I took it that way. But gradually I understood what it really meant. He had installed himself as functional head of the household. Bills went to his name. Tradesmen called him, not me. The neighbor knocked at his door when he needed something. I had become a walk-on part in my own home, politely tolerated, excluded from decisions, slowly written out of my own life. The garden fence was replaced one morning without my knowing. A tree felled, the apple tree Dorothy had planted. A room repainted in a cold gray she would never have chosen. Each time I found out afterwards. Each time there was a reasonable explanation, and each time I felt something tighten inside me. Not anger, but something colder and clearer. The awareness that I was no longer the true inhabitant of this place, that I had become, in Craig's eyes, a piece of furniture, something around which plans are made and changes carried out without ever asking it anything. Sarah came to my workshop almost every weekend, what was left of it. She liked the smell of wood and oil. We talked little and worked a lot, and that was fine. But that night she had not come to work. She sat beside me on the bed and waited until she was certain no one was listening. Then she said quietly, "Grandpa, Craig and Mum were talking about a solicitor today. Craig said he already has everything prepared. You won't have anything left." I remained completely still. I didn't ask how she knew. I already knew. I had known for weeks without quite wanting to see it. The next morning I called Mr. Pemberton before Craig was awake, not to seek advice. The preparations had been running for months. Pemberton had managed my affairs for 30 years and knew every detail of my financial situation. The draft had been ready in his office for a long time, waiting only for the signal. What was missing was the trigger. Sarah's warning was the trigger. I told Pemberton only, "It is time." He knew immediately what that meant. By the evening, the notice had to be served. My only instruction, it had to be done in one night. Perhaps you wonder why I hadn't reacted sooner. The honest answer is this: because Julie is my daughter. I thought if I had patience, if I gave space, Craig would eventually understand where he stood and what he owed. I was wrong. There are people to whom you give space, and they fill it with gratitude. And there are people to whom you give space, and they mark it immediately as their territory. Craig was the second kind. It took me longer than it should have to accept that, but it was Sarah who pulled me from my last remaining patience with a single whispered sentence. Mr. Pemberton confirmed what I hoped. The title deed had been registered exclusively in my name since the build, without any ambiguity. No shared obligations, no usage agreements, no recognized rights for Craig or Julie. They were living here as gratuitous occupiers, a legal concept with a very precise meaning in property law. He explained the requirements for the notice, the legal timelines, and the grounds for accelerated proceedings. I listened as I had in the technical briefings of my working years, calm, precise, without visible emotion. Everything was already prepared. It only needed to be served. It was already prepared. I had given Pemberton his instructions weeks earlier. As soon as the trigger arrived, he would set the procedure in motion. The trigger was Sarah's warning, not a legally admissible statement, but enough for me. Because I also had a document Craig himself had provided, a planning application to the council in which he had registered the address of my property in his name as applicant and rights holder. Without my knowledge, without my signature, without my consent of any kind. That application was the legally valid trigger for the accelerated procedure. Craig, without knowing it, had himself turned the key to his own eviction. The process server rang at 6:30 in the evening. Craig and Julie were having dinner. Sarah was with me. We had been to a concert at her school that she had been announcing to me for weeks. When I came home, Craig's keys were on the hall table. Julie opened the door with an expression I had never seen on her face. Not anger, not pain. Recognition. She knew. She had seen it coming and done nothing. I looked at her and said nothing. I went to the kitchen and made tea for Sarah and myself, as if nothing particular had happened that evening. Craig tried to negotiate. He called several times. I didn't answer. He sent messages. I read them and didn't reply. Then he came to the door. I didn't open it. The next day he sent a solicitor friend who went through the documents in an hour. The solicitor called Craig back. What he said exactly I don't know at first hand, but Sarah told me afterwards because she was in the hallway when the phone rang. He said there was absolutely nothing to be done. The title deed was clear. The accelerated procedure had been lawfully triggered. He had one night. Julie came to see me. It was shortly after 9 in the evening. She had been crying, but was no longer crying now. She asked if I really intended to go through with this. I said yes. She asked if we couldn't at least talk until tomorrow. I said, "We are talking now." She was quiet. Then she said something I hadn't expected. I knew Craig was planning something. I didn't want it to come to this. I replied, "But you didn't warn me. Your daughter warned me." That was the end of the conversation, not because I was furious with her, but because it was the truth. They packed until the early hours of the morning. Sarah was already asleep in her room, the small room at the end of the landing that I had always called her room. I sat in the kitchen drinking coffee and listened to the sound of suitcases and footsteps and muffled words between Julie and Craig. It was not a dramatic departure. No raised voices, no broken objects. Just the quiet sound of people who understand that they have lost and still cannot comprehend how it happened. When the door closed behind them, the house settled into the silence I knew. The silence after Dorothy. The next morning I took Sarah to school. We spoke little on the way. Only when we were standing in front of the school gates did she turn to me and ask, "Are you all right, Grandpa?" I looked at her, that 12-year-old girl who in one night had understood more than I had been willing to see in 2 years. I said, "I'm all right, thanks to you." She nodded, as if that were the most natural thing in the world, and walked in. I stood in front of the gates for a moment. Then I drove home and opened the workshop. I brought my tools back to the workshop. Every saw, every plane, every hammer. I put them back in their place, as I had done for 20 years. Then I carried the desk out of the room and left it on the pavement for collection. After that, I pushed the sitting room sofa back to where Dorothy had always wanted it, the exact spot Craig had moved it from one morning without asking anyone. I know that is sentimental. I know a piece of furniture doesn't bring anyone back. But when I pushed the sofa to its place, the house breathed differently, more quietly, like before. I remember exactly how Sarah and I sat on the stairs while Craig and Julie carried out the last suitcases. We said nothing. We both had a cup of tea. Outside it was dark and still, and the only sound was the wheels of the suitcases on the path. Sarah looked at me and asked quietly whether I was sad. I thought about it. Then I said, "A little, but also relieved." She nodded, as if she understood. And perhaps she really did, better than most of the adults in my life who knew everything that was happening and didn't know what to do with that knowledge. 3 weeks later, I renovated Sarah's room the way she wanted it. A small desk under the window that looks onto the garden. The color she had chosen, even though at first I found it too vivid. The weeks that followed, she spent many afternoons with me. I taught her how to work wood, how to make a joint that holds. She taught me how to download music on my phone. We talked about everything and nothing. The house was loud again, in the only way that mattered to me and that you cannot replace with anything else. In the weeks after they left, I put the house back in order, not out of bitterness, out of necessity. There were traces everywhere, a different arrangement in the cupboards, nail holes in the walls, a refrigerator full of things that weren't mine. I removed everything that wasn't mine and left it outside the door. What remained was the house I knew, the house Dorothy knew. It took a few weeks before it smelled like itself again, of coffee, of wood, of the garden in autumn. Then I knew it was mine again, as it always should have been. It was the start of something real. Julie called 3 months later. She called on a quiet Sunday morning, without Craig in the background. She wasn't crying. She said only, "I know I should have stepped in. I should have warned you." I replied, "Yes." Not cruelly, simply honestly. It was the most sincere sentence we had exchanged in years, perhaps longer. I invited her to lunch and she came. We sat at the table I had built myself, ate together, talked about Dorothy, about Sarah, sometimes about nothing in particular. It was the beginning of something, still small, still fragile, but real. She came without hesitation. With Craig, I have not spoken since, and I don't expect to. It is not bitterness. I carry nothing of him that weighs on me inside. But there are things that happened that should not have happened. He had made plans that would have erased me, quietly, systematically, politely. He had told my daughter the house was practically already theirs. He had submitted applications as though he were already the owner. All of that had consequences. That those consequences surprised him says everything about how much he had underestimated me from the very beginning. That says everything about him. Sometimes I think back to the moment Sarah came into my room, to the silence that followed. I could have spoken, with Craig, with Julie, demanded answers, sought confrontation. I didn't, not from fear, but because I knew. Noise resolves nothing lasting. A man of 70 has learned that most conflicts born in shouting end in silence and well-prepared papers. I had the papers, and I had something Craig didn't have, a child who told me the truth because she loved me. That was my real advantage in that night. That says everything about him. I had expected no less from him. The house is still here. The apple tree is gone. Craig had it felled before I could intervene. But I planted a new one. Sarah helped me. She watered it with a small watering can and then wiped her hands on her jeans and said, "This one grows for you, Grandpa." She said it as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And perhaps it was. Perhaps that is the answer to everything. Not the night, not the document, but a new tree planted by a child who knows where home is and what that word truly means. That tree is growing still. I don't speak much about this time. Not because it still hurts. That pain is old and quiet now. I don't talk about it because important things don't need an audience to remain true. But sometimes, when Sarah is visiting and the house fills again with voices and footsteps, I think, perhaps that is the real victory. Not the night, not the document, but that this house is still standing, still sounds, still smells as it did before, and that we are both still inside it, my granddaughter and I. That is more than enough. That patience was everything. Now it is your turn. Write to me in the comments. If your granddaughter had warned you late at night, "Grandpa, run, they're going to take everything," would you have acted right away without a moment's hesitation? Or would you have waited to see it with your own eyes first before believing her? And the question that genuinely interests me most, was it right that Sarah got involved at all? Or was that too much responsibility for a 12-year-old girl who only wanted to protect the grandfather she loves and visits every week? Tell me what you think. There are people who say I waited too long. Others say I should never have let things go that far. Perhaps both are partly right. I don't deny it. But I am not someone who acts before being certain, and not someone who punishes without concrete and demonstrable cause. Craig gave me that cause himself through his own impatience. The rest I handled without detour, without unnecessary drama. To anyone who asks whether I have forgiven him, I stopped thinking about him. That is more peace than any forgiveness could give me. Patience is not weakness. It is the sharpest form of strength.